We are joined by two wonderful guests. Alexandra Cardinale is managing editor at Case by Case, which is the newsletter that we will be discussing today, but really newsletter and podcast and like multi-platform media empire. And Kate Redding is the founding editor there. Between them, they have worked at iHeartRadio and the Wall Street Journal and Vox. And I saw Kate's LinkedIn, and she used to intern at Garden and Gun magazine, which is like such a cool magazine that I love. So they've been around the journalism world, and they're going to share their wisdom with us, and we're so excited to have them here. So thank you both for joining us, Kate and Alex.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Super excited.
Yay. We are ready to pick your brains. As always, folks, if you have questions that you have not previously submitted, you can drop them in the chat or like private message them to me in the chat, and we will ask those questions. So I want to start off by saying that you both are starting law school very soon, correct?
Like in 6 days. I start on Sunday.
Okay, amazing. Congratulations. Why spend your time helping journalists while you're so busy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Here, I'll go first if that's all right, Kate, and then I'll let you take it away. So a big portion of it is I knew I wanted to go into law. I know that I can see a future both being a lawyer, but also being a legal journalist, something I really wanted to do. But I spent like 5 to, and depending on how you define journalism, probably close to 10 years being a journalist, working those muscles and learning how to get really good at pitching. And I remember applying to law school being like, I worked so hard at this. I don't want to let it go. This muscle took a lot of effort to really develop. So Case by Case was really the outlet with which I could keep it up. And my hope is to keep it up through law school. So I can make sure that should I ever want to go back into journalism or just support journalists in general, which is kind of law I even want to go into. I specifically want to do First Amendment litigation to defend journalists. I know that that's the space I still want to be in. So that's how I can kind of keep my foot in the water there. So it's just kind of a personal challenge and also a personal feel like I can contribute thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a really cool kind of personal project to work on. And I think a really sort of unique way to fill that gap that some people can feel where you're applying to school and maybe you're not working full time. And I think with COVID especially, I mean, I know that I kind of had an iffy period of working. And so Alex and I actually connected through a Reddit forum for law students and applicants. And they mentioned that they were starting this project, and I said, that sounds really cool. And I just, messaged their account and said, hey, this sounds awesome. And it just happened to be something that was really up my alley. I graduated from college, from undergrad in 2019, and sort of planned to follow a path much like Alex's, working in journalism and potentially going to law school later. Of course, we all know how everyone's best laid plans kind of ended up. But this was a really great way to kind of continue something that I was really, really passionate about while kind of bridging that gap from, work and undergrad into law school.
Excellent. Well, for those who have not seen Case by Case, which hopefully folks have, because we've been excited about this happy hour, the purpose of Case by Case is literally giving away excellent, timely pitches, telling you where to pitch them, who the editors are, how to kind of frame things, background writing you need to do. It is tied up with a neat little bow. It's wonderful. But the $1 million question, where do your ideas come from? Where do these stories come from?
That's a really great question. I do want to say a lot of it is, I think Kate and I are both quite nerdy and neurotic, and we ask a lot of questions. So half of it is, I don't want to just give it to oh, trust your gut, whatever. But a part of it's when you have questions that aren't easily Googleable and that pop up in your day to be this seems odd. Why is this a thing? A good example, I think a piece I did back when I was at Vox was this piece on ramen in prison. I was literally just watching, what was that show? Orange is the New Black. And they kept joking about ramen. And I'm like, I don't get it. Why is this a joke? Why is it a running joke? And no one answered that question. So I realized that no one did that. And then you got to go answer that. And it ended up performing really, really well, and was honestly probably the best piece I feel like I got to ever do. We actually have a process where usually we do 2 two pitches essentially to each other, and that validates whether or not a pitch goes forward for case by case. So we'll do a first pitch to help someone else understand the context, do a bit more research, get like what we'll call like a first green light. And then the second instance, a couple of days later, we come back and the other person actively tries to like poke holes or ask questions and is like, okay, what would someone say who disagrees with this? What would someone say if they were like, this is a horrible idea, this is not valid, what have you missed? What would an editor say to make this not go forward? And then we have our green light number 2, and then we actually write it. Kate, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think so much of it, that back and forth is really helpful, because I think a lot of times the other person can raise questions like, oh, that's so interesting, I hadn't even thought of that. A lot of times we'll pitch back and forth things that the other person will say, I had no idea that was a thing. I don't know anything about, XYZ topic or thing that you're talking about, but I'm so interested. Which I think kind of it generates ideas on its own, kind of going through that process. But I think something that both of us do is sort of take our own interests and use it as either an angle or as a starting point. Alex writes a lot about gaming, since that's kind of where your background is and just something that you really love. I love to do environmental stuff, since that's always been like a passion of mine. If there's ever a relevant, story that's kind of coming up, but there's an angle that's not being covered, or it's like, oh, I haven't seen anyone talking about, this implication of this thing. I think that's another kind of way to, like you said, keep it timely and keep it relevant for the people that read our newsletter, but also make it something we're really passionate about that we can kind of drive forward into a pitch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if I could add on to that, I think you can't underestimate the power of like having a buddy system, like having a soundboard to just like sit there. It can be coffee. It used to be like in writers' rooms or whatever, but having a friend to, oftentimes they'll even pick up your story. So like I'll say something, I'm like, this is super weird, but like, so for example, there was like a recent fashion pitch and I was like, this seems interesting, but I don't really know anything about it, I think, and I was like gonna totally overlook it. And Kate was like, whoa, no, this is a great idea, here's why. And then she was able to take on that pitch. So having a buddy, can pick up the ideas you might overlook, but also help you find direction and solidify what the actual question you're trying to answer is for your own pitches.
So smart. Where do you see, I'm sure as people who have read a million pitches, where do you see writers struggle in their pitches? I mean, there are a lot of things I think that can go wrong, but where commonly do you see the pitfalls?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think a lot of it is, it's half people who have genuine, you are advanced in your career, or like really tough questions that I think are hard for everyone. And then there are, I think, the people who are like still early in their career, and it just takes a little time to like work that muscle. So one I'll notice from like really early journalists is they'll forget to add a news peg. And I'm like, no editor is going to pick this up unless you have a news peg, or make an argument that this is an evergreen piece, right? Like that has to be there, or they're just never picking up, or they'll ask you for it. And then you have to like go away and come back and it'll be a whole thing. I also think a lot of people don't put in enough effort into pre-interviews. I do this less so now with case by case, but particularly when I was a journalist, I would never pitch something to my editor if I hadn't already called someone and made sure that like I didn't just make something up, right? Like I think it's really easy to have a hypothesis, but be completely wrong. Just call one person, semi-validate the idea, because that way it's actually worth more investigation. And then you can go to your editor and say, I have a workable source. I actually contacted this person. This is not someone who's, a celebrity that I'll maybe never get in contact with. And those are, I think, the biggest things: newsworthiness and a news peg, and getting your sources in order.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think it's what you can see is, since I am someone who doesn't have as much experience, I think that kind of turning case by case into a real thing, kind of working with Alex's idea and what it was kind of intended to be, I think you can see that has kind of informed the structure, like talking about a news peg, things like that. We make sure to include that just so that it really is, even if it's not a fully fleshed out story, it's a fully fleshed out pitch. You have all the things to kind of fill those holes. And so I think that, and we've added them as we've gone on. We've added the editors to pitch to, but kind of making sure that we're really covering all of those holes in each pitch. I think that like what you've seen, what Alex has seen throughout kind of a longer career has kind of informed what we try to do with the newsletter.
Yeah. And if there's one thing if there's one thing I might add on to that, I think one of the things I would say that people, that's still really hard. Like after years, it's still really difficult for me. It's hard for like the best journalists. I notice sometimes people don't have a question to answer. A really great way I heard it, like one of my old editors at Vox told me, is that you have to have a guiding question and then the beginnings of an answer. I think oftentimes people come with a pitch that's just really a topic and it's not a story. And that's the biggest difference on whether or not, your editor will say, I understand what this is going to look like versus not. It's really easy to want to like boil the ocean kind of thing and like, take on way too much, and your story is going to be endless and nonsensical and it won't, people won't really respond to it, versus here's a question. And there is this like, they actually called it like the intellectual orgasm. It's like, you didn't realize that this was like a question, a scratch, itch you needed scratched. And you were like, whoa, I feel like relief and, excitement that I know this answer, and knowing that answer to the question is what I think makes a really good tight piece.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that same. I love thinking of the format as a question answer. I've seen it also described as like, you might start your thinking with a topic and then you get to an angle. You're like, all right, maybe a little smaller. And then like what you really want in the pitch is like an argument, right? Or the question and answer. Like, here's like my take on this extremely large topic. I love that framing. How much do pitch structures vary from publication to publication? Because I know a lot of us in this group are going to be pitching some like newsier outlets and some more featurey magazines. So how much do you need to know the structure, and like, where do you find that out?
That's a great question. So this is one of the things that's, I think, the most difficult for everyone, is that like every place is different, magical little snowflakes, which is really annoying ultimately, that there isn't an actual structure you can work with. Usually, at least a lot of the larger publications, they'll usually have documents, and we often link to them in case by case, just to make life a little bit easier, where it's like, they'll tell you how they want something structured, like what the title of the email should be, what questions you need to answer, blah, but like, whatever. I think the biggest thing you need to know is that there are certain questions your editor is going to want answered. So you can very briefly mention like newsworthiness, right? Source, like you should have at least a sentence on that thing. And then you keep it relatively brief, but otherwise you kind of follow their guidelines, or what someone else, oftentimes people will publish successful pitches that they've done, which is something I've noticed. There's a lot of actually like Substacks out there that publish successful pitches. So you can see like, oh, Newsweek picks up pitches that look like this versus, Harvard Business Review does it this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We know that editors' inboxes are limited, and we've seen the angry tweets from editors being like, do not send me 3 pages of an outline. Like, I don't want it. Is there an aspect of the pitch that is most important, and parts that are extraneous, or things that you think could be left on the cutting room floor?
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think, to be fair, a lot of our pitch is actually probably extraneous because we're providing you with context with which you can research and decide what's important later. Oftentimes there will be different publications we'll add just to give it a little bit of diversity, but like the Atlantic is looking for something very different than like Inverse and Polygon, right? They're looking far more for character. Inverse and Polygon are looking far more for like explanatory news journalism, right? I think the biggest challenge is figuring out who you are talking to and what parts of our pitch can you actually take and, distill to really get the point across to that person, right? So like I said, newsworthiness, sources, those are pretty key, but you don't need all of the context we give you. You could bring it down to maybe like half a paragraph to a paragraph if you needed, which arguably is really the max you should be sending an editor until they ask for more details. In which case you have this wonderful piece of context you can like run with in that second email. But that hook should really be like a paragraph. I don't know, Kate, any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's perfect. And I think that's always one of the hardest things to do, is like trying to write a really short, distilling this thing you're really passionate about and really excited to try and write about down into something short. But I think if you can do that, then exactly, they'll ask for more details and they'll ask for more context. And that's when you can kind of start piling it on. But I think if you know what you want to talk about and you kind of have that question and the answer to that question and that argument, then you can really distill that down and give them that. And if that's something that they want to run with, then you get to fill in all of the context kind of as you go.
Yeah, I will say there's also a really big difference, obviously, between freelance work and staff journalism. I know obviously a lot of you guys do freelance work, but literally the pitch structure, like that full page, I used to give to my editors. I'd be like, because they were going to ask all those questions anyways, I would give that whole thing to them and they could skim it and be like, yes, add this, cut this, do whatever. And that was essentially like the pre-production process. So I will say that like you can use the whole thing, but oftentimes it might work a bit more for staff versus freelance, which is a different approach.
Totally. I've also noticed that just like reading your newsletter has led me to think, plan better, even in stories for publications that I like regularly write for, where it's not like such a formal pitching, but I'm like, well, these are the questions you want to answer before you're like presenting this to the, to your editors. Yeah. So more plugs for reasons to subscribe for folks on here, regardless of exactly what your employment structure is. This question was submitted by one of our members ahead of time, and I thought it was great. What about if you pitched a story to an outlet in the past and they passed on it, but now you kind of have a new angle, or there's a new news peg, you found a new source, how is it okay to resubmit it, and how do you go about doing that?
Yes, 100%. If anything, I feel like very rarely are editors just like, no, this is the worst idea ever. You suck, get out of here. I personally hate you. No, like that never ever happens.
Don't write for those editors.
Yeah, like that really just never happens. If anything, like it's their job. Like they want to say yes, they want to have reasons to, because their job, like they have to hit a quota. They want to make sure that like there's good stuff for the publication and that they look good. So if you're like, yes, here's a reason why this is better now, you just have to make that argument very clear. And I feel like that's usually the biggest challenge. And sometimes you literally, I've like recommended some people and I'm like, throw the whole thing away and start over. Same idea, but you start over completely, preferably with a structure, preferably with whatever. And usually what you can ask is literally if an editor just passed it over, sure, they might ghost you, but oftentimes they'll actually be like, hey, this is what I don't understand. This is where it's not working for me. And you can go and kind of chip away at that again. So if anything, it shows that you have that kind of like tenacity to get a really good story if you're willing to work on it well from the beginning with your editor, and you're going to probably build a better relationship with them at the end of the day.
Another little maybe ethics and politeness question. Can you pitch the same story 2 places?
That is super questionable. It's okay. Look, I've known people who do it, and I also understand that like we all need to pay our rent, and like if you have a good pitch, you just want to get it somewhere. So I understand the desire, but I think in general it's not a great look, because if 2 places do say yes, you're going to look really bad if you're just like, well, awkward, I'm giving it to someone else, and you've suddenly burned that bridge, and that's not going to look great for you. So I would argue no, maybe have like a cycle of 4 or 5 pitches you have kind of going out and floating around, and then as someone, if publication A says no, then you can send it to publication B. It doesn't mean it's dead just because one publication doesn't want it, but you should take the time to make sure you get a no, or at least ghosted for a reasonable period of time, that you can be like, you didn't pick this up for a month. Now I have given it to someone else. Sorry, I would love to continue working with you, which I do think is reasonable.
Now, what is that reasonable time frame? Because one of our members, Holly, asked that question, like if they don't respond, like how do you know they haven't responded? What is the reasonable amount of time?
What's a really handy tool I use? It's free. It's called Mixmax, Mixmax, for your email, and it shows you if someone's seen your email. So it could be that like someone hasn't seen your handy. Super recommend. I use it all the time, and that way I can know, okay, you've seen it, and you might be ghosting me, or it's just like you haven't seen it. Maybe I can poke you another time. It also comes with really handy reminders to say like, it'll give you an alert if like someone hasn't looked within like a week, you can set it up within like a week, and you can be like, I want to send a follow-up, and you can set that up, and it's super handy.
I just have another kind of writing focused Substack. One more question with Brittany Robinson, who's fantastic. She did a Q&A with Alex as well. That was really, really cool. But she was putting on Twitter and said, hey, writers, if you got ghosted, maybe follow up. And I think that that's something we even kind of started thinking about when we started doing a monthly wrap up of our stories. We'll try to include why this is still relevant. And I think that that's something to maybe think about if you do get ghosted, is maybe look back at it. And if you do want to reach back out and you feel really strongly that it's a really good fit, maybe try to say, hey, this is why it's still relevant, or this is a new angle that I thought of on the same thing. But I think really pushing that relevancy, especially if it's something that I think we kind of run into this where it had a really strong news peg that's kind of faded, trying to push again another reason why it might still be kind of a good fit, I think might be a good way to slide back in and kind of diffuse some of the awkwardness of, popping up to say hi again. I think that, making it
super
fresh.
well said. Yeah, completely agree.
What are some things that have made the both of you better at pitching? How have you gotten better at it?
Writing a lot of bad ones that didn't get picked. I think, to be fair, I think also editing others, like working with Kate or working with other students or friends or whoever. I got really lucky. I have a bunch of friends in journalism. So like they would send pitches to me and be like, is this good? What do you think? What can I do? I think editing other people's pitches is probably the best thing you can do, because it makes you think like an editor. And then you can go into your own pitches being like, an editor will ask for this. I should make sure I have it.
Yeah, I think the buddy system really cannot be overstated. I think even kind of moving, going to law school, moving away from journalism, I think that working on case by case is easily some of the best writing that I've ever done. And I think kind of funny, just today I was scrolling back, looking at this at stuff we were doing in the beginning, us working together, and I'm like, we've both gotten so tight, and like I can see, especially my own writing has gotten so much stronger and cleaner just from having someone with more experience to kind of bounce that off of. But also there have been times where, I've sent a pitch that we did or a podcast that we did to my friends that have no experience in journalism, and they've said, well, what about this? What about this? I think this is so interesting because it was something that was relevant to their interests. So I think just whether it's someone that has experience, whether it's another writer, or whether it's just someone that you're like, hey, I know that you like gaming and play RuneScape. We just did a podcast on RuneScape. You should listen to it. Has fostered some really good conversations and definitely made me think about questions that I hadn't maybe thought about addressing before, which I think has really pushed me to kind of, answer those questions the first time and work on kind of filling gaps in my writing that I wouldn't have identified if I didn't have a buddy.
Well, guild plug, everyone here has buddies because you're all in the guild together. So, let's use the power of numbers here. Built in people to bounce pitches off of. I love reading other people's pitches. So something I have been curious about, I once had an editor at a magazine tell me that there were no reinventing the wheel in media. Like, stories have been written, formats are established. We're not gonna reinvent the wheel. But we also know that pitches thrive on like original ideas, and the best stories are ones that answer the ramen question that you can't Google because it doesn't exist. So how do you strike that balance between like delivering a fresh angle but not being so weird and outside the box that like a publication isn't going to pick it up because it's just so different from what they normally do?
Yeah, so this is a personal trick. Not everyone follows it. Take it with a grain of salt. I find when I have a question, and this is so specific, I will try and Google it or Google the topic around it. And if at least 2 to 3 major publications have talked about something similar, then I'm like, good, yes, green light, check mark. But if more than like 6 have talked about it, I'm like, no, 2 talked about, I'm going to drown in like the SEO. My story's never going to do well. So boo, won't talk about it. Go on to something, just like go on something else. And that's my little gut check to be like, is there enough interest in something like this? So like, for example, there was a couple stuff about like food in prison, but not really one about like ramen specifically, not really about like an economic question about food. And I was like, okay, but interesting enough that like someone's curious, so someone will read this on the internet, right? As opposed to if you, I don't know, it's like really easy to come up with like maybe a climate change pitch, but like everybody talks about it because it's a really obvious angle, and it like, or like the Olympics, if you're talking about like feminism at the Olympics, like that's a great pitch, but also like everyone has talked about it and they will have more resources than you and they'll put it out faster than you. So like save yourself some time and energy and find something with a different angle. So that's usually my go-to of like whether or not something's worth it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of social media, kind of on the flip side of that. I go back and forth on kind of, I think it's great that social media has allowed so many more voices into the conversation. I think it can be really cool, and something that I've done for a few pitches. I guess what I go back and forth on is sometimes I'm like, oh, it's social media. It's hard to verify. Things can get very muddled in the conversation. But when I find, an influencer or someone who has a voice in a specific space that is verifiable, right? There's someone that I love in kind of the sustainable fashion environmental space who she's got a master's in supply chain management. That feels verifiable to me. I can understand that. And when I see her talking about things that I'm not seeing publications really pick up on, that's sometimes where I will start a story. If it's being talked about by multiple people, there are some people on Twitter that I love to follow that talk about a lot of things kind of almost covering social media and seeing these things that are like trending and being talked about in a way that you can verify that's not just like one random tweet, since that's a little bit, questionable to deal with. I think that can be kind of a cool place to say people are interested in this, people are talking about this, but maybe publications haven't picked it up yet. And I think that can be kind of a way to distinguish yourself from, other pitches.
I'll also add to that there's very similar on the social media. There's a lot of social media that like almost self-verifies. So for example, I love like Reddit our data is beautiful, which is like a great place to start, because you have a lot of people who are like very interested in a piece of data that someone will create and publish. So like, for example, the video game piece that we just put out this week, that was literally based on someone posted something on Reddit, and I was like, wow, that's crazy. And all of the questions about it were interesting. People naturally followed up, and I was like, this validates that this is a question no one's answered. Can I come up with an interesting angle? And I thought we did. So that was like, that's a great spot. There was one, there's like an Instagram, was it Kate? It was like Fat Finger Data or something. That's like also a great one.
It's very similar. It's just they conduct like surveys, I guess. I'm not really sure what their base is. That's the one question I have about them. But yeah, Fat Finger Data on Instagram, they ask like really relevant questions and try to get a number on it, which I think is also really cool. And kind of like you said, will self-verify to like a piece that you can work with.
Yeah. And like, obviously you have to follow up on that. You get other sources, you cross-reference for that, but it's a great place to start.
Speaking of sourcing, no matter what your beat is, there's the temptation to go back to the same well of sources all the time. And sometimes that's great because you have great relationships and you can hit them up at a moment's notice. But that can also mean that certain voices don't get included and it's kind of the same folks talking all the time. How do you guys diversify your Rolodex, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And to be fair, I was never like a beat reporter per se. So I never quite had that problem. I did realize as I started to get more specific in like, for example, gaming and tech, you get a couple of the same voices. I think a lot of that's really on the journalist to take the time to say, because like there's always more than one expert, right? There's always like a second person. A really great way is, for example, when I end an interview or something, I'll literally write into my list of questions, can you give me the names of 3 people I should talk to who are not you, who can give me a second opinion? Because, everybody's nice and has the best intentions, but sometimes people are wrong, right? Or just not very smart, whatever. Like you should double check your sources. I've had some crazy sources where I'm like, glad I didn't go with those guys. So I definitely take the time to ask who they talk to, and I think who they look up to, and that'll help you diversify it. But that does take effort on your part as a journalist.
I think being just conscious of that is huge. When, the first few times that Alex and I talked, kind of talking about this idea, and, I myself being there to kind of execute on it, that was already built in. That was already something Alex knew needed to be included, was diverse sources. And so I think it does take a little bit more time. Of course, if there's an expert on a certain subject who is maybe a white man, you should go to that person. And if there are people that keep coming up because they are experts on a certain topic, that's completely fine. They know what they're talking about. But I think trying to actively search for those diverse voices and those new voices, just having that kind of top of mind, I think is half the battle already. And then, sometimes there is no one there, which is always a disappointment. But I think if you're actively searching out those kind of, less heard voices, that's huge. That's really important.
Yes. And I swear this question was not just a setup for me to plug the Guild's diverse sources database, which is on our website, everybody, and you can look at it for beer industry related sources. That was created by Jeff Allworth, and we host it on our website now too. So yes, just a reminder to our members that we have that. Julie had a really great question about how fast to pull the trigger on a pitch. Like, how much research should you have done before? Like, okay, it's validated, it's like a good idea. Like, how far do you need to get down the rabbit hole?
Well, so the thing is, you don't want to go that far. And in fact, editors will like very actively tell you to not go that far because they don't want something that looks like a finished product. And this is a very hard line to figure out, to be fair, I recognize this. And to actually kind of answer Holly's question, super normal to send a million pitches everywhere and they don't get picked up. That's just like part of the game, a lot of it's sales. But so when you have like, you want to go, I would say like maybe one step past initial research and like, yes, you have a validated idea. And this is actually a really like why I love the question answer format, because if you have a good question and the beginnings of an answer, it means you still have way more research to do to finish the answer, but you know there is an answer. You know there is a like final comment you can make, an argument you can make, something you can advocate for, whatever. But there is like a wrap up to this thing. You don't want to have that whole answer finished, mostly because A, an editor may never pick it up, and that was just like a waste of a ton of work. Or B, that they're going to want you to go in a different direction. They'll be like, I love this idea, I love this structure, but we want to go that way, not that way. And you went that way and spent all this time on that. And you're not getting compensated for that. So that's a really big thing to think about. You don't want to spend these hours doing something that doesn't quite go anywhere. So you want to make sure that it's like validated, but not over-researched.
Yeah, I mean, all of that is incredibly well said. And I think the one thing that I've kept in mind, honestly, since college, advice that I got from a professor was don't lock yourself into one perspective. I think it's really easy if you do too much research, and if you do feel really strongly one way and you're ready to say, this is the answer and I'm going down this path and I know that it's going to lead to this, this, and this, you could still be wrong. I think that that's something I've run into before with more full-fledged pieces, that I worked on in college, was thinking that I had this great idea, doing this preliminary research that showed one side of the story, and then getting into interviews and realizing that it wasn't quite that way. So I think leaving that room for yourself to kind of switch up if you need to, or if you find something really cool as you go down the rabbit hole that you want to kind of move on to that track, I think leaving yourself that room is super key and gives you some flexibility.
I think maybe this will be our final question. This countdown timer is like stressing me out. But one of our members had a kind of a meta question, which is maybe a cool way to end this, about how you guys feel about like Substack as a writing platform. Like, let's be real, are you making money doing this? Like, how are you finding the monetization? Do you like Substack? Would you recommend potentially?
Yeah, great question.
Yeah.
It's a tough one. There's a lot of debate out there. It's a very hot topic right now. We do this purely labor of love project. We have like a couple of paid subscribers, vast majority are unpaid, and we just like giving out ideas. Like that's it. I just do this in my free time. Like we always just do this in our free time. I think I can see us as we get larger wanting to get off of it. It's great in that it's so simple. Like I will sit there and debate like which font I want to use for a week, and that is absolutely unhelpful to anybody, where they're like, here's 2 fonts, and I'm like, great, I can pick out a 2. And I can just start. It's so hard to just put something out there. You have to do 100 things in a row. They're all going to suck until you get one good one, and you need to just get that practice going, whatever's in your way. So Substack is a great starter platform. Don't know if we're going to keep it up as we grow. TBD.
Yeah, definitely. I like how simple it is. Like Alex said, very streamlined. I think one of the best things we did that actually, I mean, people can be very generous, is we set up a Ko-fi, Ko-fi, where people can make one-time donations, which I think feels like a much lower bar than, a monthly subscription platform, which is great for a lot of people, and I think makes a lot of sense for Substack as it is, as well as other platforms like Patreon, something like that. But yeah. I really think the one-time donations are very cool, and people have been very generous, which I was not expecting at all. So I'm glad that we did that.
Nice. That hybrid model, that's cool. Holy cow, that was like the most fast and furious 40 minutes. I wish we could do so much longer. But Alex and Kate, thank you so much. And
this is great.
Everybody subscribes and reads your wonderful newsletter, and we are just so glad that you joined us. Thank you for that.
Yeah, tweet at us if we have other questions we didn't answer, by the way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having us. This was awesome.
Yeah. Thanks, folks. Thanks for everyone for joining.
All right. See ya. Bye, guys.